So now we're going to learn about CSS selectors. And remember what the CSS selector does. So we have our separation of concerns. We have HTML and we have CSS. And HTML is for the structure and CSS is for the formatting. And the way we format our HTML is over here in the CSS, we create rule sets. And so here's a picture of a rule set, and I know this is a review, but through review, through repetition, things sink in. And so we have our rule sets, and our rule sets start out with a selector. And so the selector targets an element on the page and says, select this element or this item and make it this way. And so one of the ways we could create a selector is with an element. And so here you could see the paragraph element is the selector. We already saw this example here, and we could go through and see how these different selectors, the header selector over here in the CSS is targeting the header element over in the HTML, and it's saying make it this way. So here's the entire rule set. This is the selector. This is the declaration block. Here are declarations, and each declaration is made up of a property and a value. So we're going to learn all about different selectors we can use. The first selector are like these element selectors. So these are element selectors, right? And they are selecting by the element name all of the elements on the HTML page that are either, that type of an element. So if there's more than one header on the HTML page, we would be selecting all of the headers on the HTML page. And you could also have multiple selectors like this down here. So we've already seen this example, and that's an element selector. So that's one of the phrases you need to, put into your head, element selectors. And now we're going to learn about class and ID selectors. So the code here in element selector, that's the code you just saw. It's repeat code, but I just wanted to put it right there so that under CSS selectors we're very thorough and we have all that code to reference. Let's take a look at a class selector now and see how class selectors work. So I'm going to open up both those files, right click, choose split vertically, and bring my CSS over here. That way my CSS is on the right, and I could shift that over, and my HTML is on the left. And if I needed more room, I could click this little arrow right there and shift that over, and now I could see, like, cool, there's all of my code. Very nice. And I'll just move this a little bit over, just a little more. So there we go. Perfect. All right, so here I have the class emphasize. Well, I could come over here and I could see where is that class being applied. And if I click emphasize there, and then I think it's Alt-J on Windows, now I have selected the next instance of emphasize, and those are all the instances where on this HTML page I am applying the class emphasize. So a class is something we can add as an attribute to a tag. And so the paragraph tag has the class attribute set to the value of emphasize. And this paragraph tag also has the class attribute set to the value of emphasize. And we could add classes anywhere we want, as many times as we want throughout an HTML page. So classes can be used over and over and over again. And this one rule set right here with a selector, this is a class selector, and a class selector, the notation to denote's the right one. The notation to denote that this is a class is the period. So in your CSS, any selector that starts with a period is a class. That's a class. So there's period emphasize. The class emphasize, that's the selector, and selecting each of these paragraphs, and it's saying, hey, change the color to red. So that's going to make the text color red. And if we look at this page, we can see that right here. And the text color of what we want to emphasize is red. So we're able to have one rule set which we could apply to many different places, and we could use that class to select many different tags, and just, they could be paragraphs, they could be LIs. Like right here, I could do class emphasize and then come back here and refresh the page, and that got emphasized. And so that's how classes work. I guess I'll leave that one in there too. That's kind of cool. Technologists is emphasized. So those are classes, all right? And that's how you use a class. And you could, there you go, put them in there. One thing to know about naming classes is I would not want to name this class red. I named it emphasize. And the reason I named it emphasize is because if I named it red, we might later want to say, no, we want that to be hot pink. Well, now red doesn't really make sense. So emphasize makes PH. Emphasize makes much more sense as a name for that class. So that's classes. And the main thing to take away from classes, they start with a period in CSS, and you could use them many times, right? On your HTML page, you could apply class to all kinds of different tags. All right, so that's a class. Next thing we're going to look at are IDs. So down here at 019 CSS Selectors, we have the next folder, IDs. So here's the correct way to do IDs. And the difference between a class and an ID, one of the main differences, is that an ID can only be used once. You can only use an ID once. So if I have promote here, I come over and I say, okay, where is promote? Promote's right there. And if I look for any other instances of promote, I'm pressing Alt-J, which my key map reference tells me, Alt-J will select the next occurrence. So it just keeps selecting all the occurrences of that item. Like if I selected the word Mozilla, and then just, I'm selecting all of the Mozillas on the page. Here I'm selecting all the promotes on the page. There's only one. I can only use the ID once. That's it. So classes many times, IDs once. And an ID, the notation to denote that this is an ID in the CSS is the £sign. You might call it the hash symbol, right? Either one, £sign hash symbol. That's how you say this is going to target the ID promote. And here is the paragraph tag with an ID attribute, the value set to promote. So it's going to make this paragraph red. And let's just prove that and then go look at it. And here it is. This one paragraph here became red. If I change that, I can make it green. And now it's green. So that's the correct way to create IDs. The incorrect way, right, is right here. And the reason this is incorrect is because I have multiple IDs of the same one on the same page. And my editors even underline those in red. And importantly, this is important, over here on the right, I've got duplicate ID reference, a little red hash and a red exclamation point up here. And so just watch this gutter over on the right. Look at that when you're working on your code and just make it a practice. Let me look over on the right. Are there any red dashes right there? And that tells you there's an error. And the error is duplicate ID reference. An ID can only be referenced once. All right, so that's the first thing to learn about selectors. For rule sets, for CSS rule sets, you have selectors. And the most commonly used selectors are element selectors and class selectors. ID selectors are also commonly used, not quite as common as class and element, but still common. So these are like the top selectors you will use when writing your CSS. In the next videos, we're going to learn about some more CSS selectors.